Hi, I'm Janae.
Hi, and I'm Maria.
Today we're going to be talking about Book 1, Chapter 14, Political Crime. Today our special assignment will focus on political crime and how it affects every society of the world. Political crime is defined as any legal or social harmful act aimed at preserving or changing the existing political and social order. Political crime has existed for centuries, and it takes on many forms and falls into two categories: crime by government and crime against government.
Many scholars agree the definition of political crime is very vague, since the concept of what is socially harmful is open to interpretation. One thing is for sure, political crime is performed for ideological reasons.
Crime by government is also referred to as state crime or state criminality, and it aims to preserve an existing order, and it comes in the form of political repression, human rights violations such as genocide, torture, assassination, other violence, surveillance, infiltration, arrest, persecution, and imprisonment. Unethical and legal experimentation, adding and abetting of corporate crimes, and finally, political corruption, although at times it is placed under occupation crimes. Many governments, include democratic nations such as U.S., are guilty of committing some of these crimes.
Crimes by government, which throughout history have been carried out through the use of violent and legal means to repress any dissenters and preserve inequality, although more common in totalitarian regimes, democratic nations such as the US have also engaged in such forms of crime by government. Political repression and human rights violations, one of the forms of crime by government, which include genocide, torture, assassination, and other violence such as surveillance, infiltration, and legal repression.
Genocide, the ultimate form of repression, and the term was condoned during World War II, refers to deliberate exploitation of a group because of its race, religion, ethnicity, and nationality. Genocide is often referred as crime against humanity for being the worst form of crime by government. A famous crime example of such was genocide committed against the Jews by Nazi during World War II.
Government can also resort to less drastic violent measures than genocide, such violence includes torture, beatings, assassinations, executions, and mass murder. These types of government ruling by terror are often called state terrorism. International human rights have documented thousands of government-sponsored murders, beatings, and related violence across the world, in countries such as Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa, where dissenters are often kidnapped, tortured, murdered, raped by government troops. Such heinous crimes are common among totalitarian and democratic nations.
The cornerstone of democratic and freedom of movement and lawful dissent, and ironically another form of crime by government involves surveillance and infiltration and disruption. Example of including the FBI counterintelligence program called CORDOPRO for 1964, which targeted communist and socialist work. Another example includes attempts to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. from continuing his effort in the civil rights movement. Or recently, after the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government increased the surveillance of people suspected of terrorism. Legal repression is another form of crime by government. Preferred by terrorism, a government implicates the arrest, imprisonment of dissenters in an attempt to use law, legitimate political repression, such as crime, has also been known to occur in democratic nations as well, in citizens.
Unethical and illegal experimentation is yet another form of crime by government. Perhaps one infamous example of such is the atrocious acts committed by Nazi scientists who would strip naked camp prisoners and take them outside and leave them in sub-freezing temperatures to see how long it would take them to freeze to death. Although difficult to believe, but such behavior is also common among democratic nations like the US.
Crimes by government also takes the form of state corporate crimes, much as corporate crimes occur because of the government ability or unwillingness to have stronger regulations or effective laws enforcement against large corporations. Social scholars have discussed scenarios in which governments, agencies, corporations cooperate with each other to commit such legal and social harmful activities. It is often said state corporate crimes represent an intersection of corporate crimes and crimes by government.
The final form of crime by government is political corruption, whether it's by personal gain or for political power or influence. Political corruption for personal gain can occur when officials at the local, state, or federal levels of government misuse their office for personal economic gain, most often in the forms of bribes, kickbacks, or favors they give to businesses or individuals. Political corruption can also result from officials' misuse of political power and influence, such as campaign fraud.
The second category of political crime is crime against government, which aims to change the existing order, includes terrorism, assassination, and other political violence, nonviolent civil disobedience, and espionage and treason. This category of political crime consists of crimes by individuals or organizations who oppose the government and other established interests.
Motivations for such criminal behavior is largely ideological, and it's aimed to change the existing role. Their strong political convictions, which result in such behavior, cause these individuals to be referred to as convictional criminals. They can be violent, nonviolent, they can also be members of organized protest groups, or can act alone. Perhaps a famous example of such a criminal was Martin Luther King Jr., whose behavior might have been condemned at the time, but whose illegality contributed to the freedom of thought many societies enjoy today. It is why some people view this type of political criminals as common lawbreakers, whereas others consider them heroes.
More violent forms of crime against government takes the form of mass political violence, rebellion, riots, and terrorism. These violent acts are often committed by groups of individuals, although they can be committed by individuals as well. They are often committed to change the status quo, although these acts are often considered irrational acts of violence by determined individuals. The motivation and purpose are often rational, such as political violence has deep historical roots. For example, the pleasant of the revolts in pre-industry Europe and the labor riots that replaced them after the industrialization occurred.
Perhaps the most severe form of crime against government is terrorism, simply because it involves the killing and maiming of innocent bystanders. Such senseless deaths fill members of society with rage. Terrorism is defined as the use of unexpected violence to intimidate or coerce people in the pursuit of a political or social objective. Motivation behind it is to fringe or demoralize one's political targets or public at large. Terrorism takes on several types. State terrorism, which involves the use of police and other government agents to repress their citizens through violent means, most common in totalitarian nations. But it also has occurred in democratic nations. Vigilante terrorism, initially by private groups against other private groups in order to preserve the status quo. Much of this type of terrorism takes the form of hate crimes. Insurgent terrorism is designed to bring about political change. Such violence include bombings, shootings, kidnappings, hijacking, and their targets include public figures, general public buildings, or means of transportation. The 9/11 attacks are a good example of the final form of terrorism. Transnational terrorism, or also known as global terrorism, which is committed by residents of one or more nations against humans and property targets of another nation.
Political assassination, the murder of public figures for political reasons, is another form of political violence against government. These assassinations are often a part of large campaigns of political tourism or they can also be a result of individuals bearing a political grudge. These assassinations are only considered political assassinations if there are political motives behind them. Some famous examples include the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, President John F. Kennedy, and his brother Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, among others. There have also been other public figures who were victims of assassination attempts, like President Gerald Ford and President Ronald Reagan.
Not all crimes against government are violent. They also take the form of public and nonviolent crimes, such as civil disobedience. It is the violation of laws for people for ideological reasons. Civil disobedience protesters violate these laws they consider morally unjust and await to be arrested for the act. The concept of civil disobedience can be traced back since ancient Greece, but it also is talked about in the Bible. It has been carried out for various religious reasons as well. In 1849, David Thoreau publicized a famous essay on the subject, which had a profound influence on civil rights leader Martin Luther King, who subsequently wrote one of his own, Letter from Birmingham City Jail, after he was arrested during a peaceful civil rights march in 1969. During the presidential election of November 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested after violating the federal law that prohibited all women from voting. Or who could forget the heroic refusal from Rosa Parks to move back to the back of the bus in her efforts to end segregation between blacks and whites. Nonviolent civil disobedience became the key strategy of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Political crime is best seen as a consequence of power crime by government, which is carried out by those in power. On the other hand, crime against government is carried out by those without power. Some explanations for this behavior emphasize in the social, psychological factors, while others emphasize in the structural factors. Social psychological explanations focus on emotions and other psychological states that motivate people to engage in protest, especially if they become upset for feeling relatively deprived in comparison to other social groups. Structural explanations focus on microstructural factors such as pre-existing friendship or organizational ties with individuals who belong to social movement organizations. They also focus on political opportunity theory, which stresses that movements are likely to arise when changes in national government promise to be receptive or vulnerable to movement challenges.
In Western nations such as U.S., crime by government is almost always committed by whites, men, or middle or upper class, since the occupy almost all positions of political power. Although at times the accurate act of oppression by government and carried out by workers class soldiers like policemen, non-white individuals, and occasionally females too. In non-Western nations, ethnicity or religion are often become more important, since the privileged men with political power usually belong to the dominant ethnic or religion groups in the nations. In both Western or non-Western nations, target of government are typically those without power, members of the subordinate race, ethnicity, and religions. Both forms of political crime are given very little attention in comparison of other forms of street crimes, partly because political crime is also universally historical and cross-national nations, and that it seems natural and inevitable and is best understood as function of a power. To reduce it must reduce disparities of powers along society. Many dissenters will continue to turn to civil disobedience and other legal activities as long as they see flaws in government. Therefore, to reduce such crime, nations must reduce poverty, racial discrimination, military violence, and other forms of behavior which promotes dissent.
The 9/11 attacks stimulated thinking in combating terrorism. Many counterterrorism experts support combined law enforcement military approach, emphasizing in military strikes, arrest, and harsh prison terms for offenders. Some experts believe this approach ironically strengthened terrorist groups by giving them more resolve and public sympathy. Others agree another way to combat terrorism would be to address the problem underlying the grievance the terrorists have. However, this would be impossible because it would mean that the nation under attack would have to drastically change the culture which makes them a target. Like in the case of the U.S., we would have to drastically change our American culture. Political crime is part of the perpetual struggle between established interests and the state and forces for social change. As we have seen, political crime takes on many forms. Crime by government often results in crime against government. Political crime reminds us political crime reminds us what is legally right and wrong sometimes differs from what is morally right or wrong. This is why political crime deserves more attention than what it has received.